Well, greetings, everyone. This is Kip. I'm one of the pastors here at Asbury United Methodist Church. And during the coronavirus isolation, our staff's been trying to do a daily check-in on Facebook Live at 10 o'clock every morning. And today we're going to depart from that format a little bit because I wanted to visit with Robin Rossow. Robin you're a counselor, right?
I am. Mental health counselor, yep.
Licensed professional counselor in mental health. I read the title there. And you have your own business here in Sioux Falls?
I do. I have my own private practice here called Discover Wellness.
Okay, and you've been in business here for 10 years or around different places?
Well, I've been practicing mental health for about 10 years. I had relocated out of state for a couple of years, but have been here since 2015 now.
Okay, great. Well, Robin was gracious enough to spend some time with us today. And so I was curious about some of the things that she's doing as a counselor to address what's happening in our society right now. So maybe, Robin, I'll just have you introduce yourself a little bit, tell people where you're from,
Sure.
What you've been up to, maybe a little about I know you're married and you have a little baby and things like that. So why don't you just introduce yourself?
Okay, happy to. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah.
So I'm a mental health counselor here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I've grown up in South Dakota. I have quite the affiliation with the Methodist Church. My grandfather, Lloyd Grenager, actually, he was the second pastor to serve at Asbury from 1952 to 1957. And so that he had two sons who also served in the Methodist Church, my uncle, Howard Grenager, and then, of course, my father, Eric Grenager. And then, of course, I have the affiliation then with Rebecca Trebs and Steve Trebs, who are also involved in the Methodist Conference here. So have close ties with the Methodist Church. And being a preacher's kid, we moved around South Dakota my whole life. So
Right.
Flandreau, Lead, Watertown, Presho, you name it. So
you graduated from high school in Lead, is that right?
I graduated from high school in Lead in 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And I attended just a few universities. I couldn't make up my mind, and so I transferred a few times, but I eventually graduated with my undergrad degree from Dakota State in business and marketing, and then decided to make a career change and attended South Dakota State University and got my master's in counseling in 2011.
Great.
Yeah.
Your grandparents, Lloyd was pastor at Asbury, second pastor you mentioned. Your other grandparents,
Yes.
I served Spearfish for 12 years as pastor, and they were members of the congregation there. So I remember Harvey and Carol very well from Spearfish.
My mom's parents, yeah.
And your aunt and uncle, Dale and Carol Sander.
Yes.
And people from the Methodist tradition might want to know that, like when they go to Lake Ponset Camp and they're staying in the Grenager Lodge.
Or at Storm Mountain, there's the Sander Lodge.
The Sander Lodge at Storm Mountain, that you're part of that heritage there. So
yeah, we've got a long history. Lake Ponset and Storm Mountain sort of always felt like my camps that everybody else was visiting.
Right. Well,
everybody was
true. Yeah. With all the Sanders and Grenagers, I think at annual conference they could probably pass any legislation that they wanted,
right,
by the number of clergy that they have. Well, anyway, I'm grateful that you're willing to spend some time with us, Robin, and thankful for your work that you're doing.
Yeah.
We just started a series last Sunday we're calling Reset, and we're looking at kind of like the idea of a reset button, how if things get messed up, you wish you could press a button instead of reset and everything would go back to normal.
Yeah.
And it would just be, oh, this is great. Everything's just like
it was. The easy button from Staples, right?
Right. Yeah, easy button. Yeah. But it doesn't usually work that way. And
right.
And so what we're doing is looking at different scriptures of how the disciples, after Jesus died and rose again, how they were kind of looking for, well, what's the normal now? You know, we had hoped in our scripture on the road to Emmaus, the disciples are saying we had hoped Jesus was the one to, save us and redeem Israel. And then also kind of we had hope talks about their expectations that all of a sudden are broken, the hopes they had, their plans they made, all that's kind of shattered. They're going through this grief. And what's it mean that Jesus is gone now? And they're starting to realize, well, he's risen and with us, but they don't know what that means. And they're doing all these things to adjust. And it talks about how they're sad and they're afraid. This week, we're going to look how the disciples were locked behind doors because they're afraid. And so all these reactions of their lives, of how do we adjust to this new normal of Jesus being risen. And we're kind of relating that to how in our lives we're trying to figure out, well, how do we reset our lives? And maybe it's not going back to an old normal, but maybe there's going to be a new normal.
Right.
That we had hope for these things, but now we still have hope, but it might mean something different now,
Yeah.
with Christ with us. And so last week, getting ready for the sermon I put on Facebook, I asked people, what are things you had hoped for, but all of a sudden changed because of this virus thing? And 80 people responded, all the way from things like missing graduations, proms, can't celebrate anniversaries, loved ones have died, we can't go to their funerals, and just all this list of things. A lot of things are like calendar things that have changed or been postponed or canceled, but also kind of this grief and all that kind of thing. So I'm curious what your experience has been as a counselor with all this stuff going on. Kind of what are some of the challenges you're seeing that people are facing, and then maybe after that, what can we do to address those or cope with some of those things? But what are you experiencing in your work?
Yeah. Well, just based on your sermon series, I guess this pandemic came at the appropriate time, right? Because everything that you're describing that the disciples were going through is essentially what humankind is experiencing right now. This expectation for what the world was going to be like right now, and then it just changes suddenly. And so we have to adapt our expectations. But man, that's a process, right? We want it to be an instant where we can just snap our fingers and our expectations change, but the brain doesn't really work that way, unfortunately. And so, a lot of what I'm noticing is, how do we adjust and adapt to essentially these new roles, familiar roles, but these roles that we have to perform in a new way, you might say. I hear a number of people talking about the struggle right now with, how do I work from home? How do I show up as a teacher for my children? How do I continue to provide meals for everybody? How do I show up as a spouse? And oh, by the way, how do I take care of myself during all of this as well? There's just so many different hats that usually we get to compartmentalize those hats. We have a specific time of the day when we're going to do work. We have a specific time of the day when we're going to eat, when we parent, when we go to bed. And all of those lines have sort of blurred at this point. And so it's really hard for people to figure out, how do we show up in relationship right now when all the rules have changed, essentially. And there's definitely a lot of anxiousness about that.
Very, very much so. Very much so. I think we all experiencing that. And I was noticing that on things people were saying with the Facebook stuff, is just all the adjustments that they have to make. Are there other challenges you've been seeing with all this as well, then?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an increase in people's anxiety right now, related to a number of different factors, whether it's related to, this mindset of either if I'm going to contract this virus, or when I'm going to contract this virus. Or I hear a number of people expressing, this fear of, I don't have fear for myself if I was to get it, but I have a great deal of concern about protecting the people around me, and not spreading it to them. So anxiousness about that, and how we can personally keep ourselves safe, and the people that we love around us safe as well. But there's also a lot of what I would describe as grief as well. And maybe people don't necessarily recognize it as grief, or maybe they're starting to now. But even whether it's grief related to somebody that we've lost, or the grief of just the overall general experience that we're all going through right now, but also grief related to that sense of normalcy and what we had expected life to look like in the month of April and May for all of us, just that normalcy of routine. The grief of not being able to, walk over to a neighbor's house and connect with them. The grief of having to say no to our kids a lot when they're asking to go and do things and see their friends. There's just a lot of grief right now because of the loss of familiar routine that creates this sense of predictability for all of us. And that predictability is what essentially helps to manage any kind of anxiousness that we feel. So lots of anxiety right now, lots of grief as well.
We had a team meeting the other night for our children, youth, and families area, and our team leader is Anna Suko, one of the members of our church, and part of what she was talking about as the opening, she talked about grief during this time, and she kind of talked about those old traditional Kubler-Ross, stages of grief, the 5
Yep.
different stages of grief, how there's, what is it, shock and anger and denial and
Bargaining.
bargaining and then acceptance. And
Yes.
so we were talking about kind of those different things and how it doesn't always go in a straight line, but those are
No.
some things we're all experiencing. And somebody made the comment of that word acceptance might even, they suggested a different word of adjustment rather than acceptance, because acceptance sometimes means, oh, it's fine and everything's great, and sometimes it's more of we need to adjust to that in
Yes.
some way. So I thought that was a helpful insight, but people are experiencing all those different emotions and things like that.
Yes.
So are there other things you see in terms of the challenges people are facing, or how people are adjusting or coping, or suggestions of how we can cope better, or other things you're seeing?
Yeah. I also really want to normalize. A lot of people are expressing frustration, like gratitude to be able to have time with family, but also a lot of overwhelm, especially because we're seeing a lot of behaviors come out in children right now. And um, what I'd like to say about children's behaviors is that behavior has meaning, right? And so every behavior that you see essentially is expressing some sort of emotional need that a child has. And because there's just a lot of frustration, with kids hearing that word no a lot right now, because they don't get to see their friends, because there's uncertainty in their schedule, because their school year ended so abruptly. They are experiencing a great deal of emotions as well, but they just don't have the language like we as adults are able to have, because we have the fully developed brains at this point, and theirs are still growing. And so they are just expressing what they are experiencing through their behaviors, and that can be really testing and wearing on parents. And so, trying to find grace for your kids, trying to find grace for yourself, in the fact that this is temporary, and this really is just a reaction to something that is totally out of their control, right? It's really out of our control, but children feel it even more so. They
Okay.
don't get to make decisions about what our day looks like tomorrow. We do.
Okay.
And so lots of parenting challenges right now as well.
A lot of patience, and I like your word, a lot of grace is needed to extend to the people you're living with and to yourself to deal with it as well, huh?
Yes.
Okay.
The other unique factor that I'm also noticing, for some people, not everybody, but if people have experienced trauma from their past, and trauma can be defined in a small way or a big way. Sometimes experiences like this can kind of stir up old, familiar feelings that are really uncomfortable for people, feelings of abandonment, feelings of isolation. Lots of people have been expressing, like, I don't feel accomplished. And so sometimes old traumas start to come back up to the surface that maybe we thought were in our past, and we thought that they were sort of behind us. And so I am seeing some of that as well. And so we're able to process both, the experience, the trauma that's happening right now, we're living through it right now, but also how it's bringing up to the surface this old stuff that, nobody really wants to deal with or acknowledge most of the time, but then here it is, and
Right.
we don't really have a choice.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can relate to a lot of what you're talking about there. Seeing in ourselves and family members and people in our church around us, just all the different things people are going through. So what are some things you suggest that, okay, this
Yeah,
will be helpful in this time of the
absolutely.
season of our lives? What would be helpful to help cope with it or deal with it?
Yeah. You
Because
know,
I don't have a reset button.
I know. I wish I had a reset button too. But
Yeah.
essentially, I think that I think that this period of time can be seen as an opportunity. But of course, giving yourself that permission to go through all of those stages of grief at the same time, right? And so sometimes those stages of grief are going to happen all of them are going to happen in one day. Sometimes all of them might happen in an hour, right? It's not that it's, a predefined time period that it's going to take for us to go through these. So like being patient with yourself and normalizing for yourself. And two words that I really encourage people to use during this time are, of course. Of course, I feel scared in this moment. Of course, I feel angry in this moment. Of course, I don't have patience in this moment. Just validate for yourself anything that you're feeling right now, because it's not right or wrong. It's just, how do we survive this period of time? When we are going through a trauma, it's not about processing the trauma and healing from it. Right now, it's about surviving the trauma.
Okay.
And so just some daily things that a person can do. What I suggest is trying to develop some sort of a schedule or routine. And I use that word loosely, like a loose schedule, a loose routine, right? Especially if you're at home with children trying to work. But even just designating, a chunk of time is going to be used for schoolwork. A chunk of time is going to be used for lunch. A chunk of time is going to be used for doing work at home, just to create some predictability and routine for yourself. Because when we don't have that predictability, our system, our energy is off. Because right now we're required to make a lot of decisions without routine. And making decisions is exhausting. It is exhausting, right? So if people can develop a loose routine, I think that's really healthy. Just some of the basics. Now that it's getting nicer outside, thankfully, try to be outside at least 30 minutes every single day. As Northern Midwesterners, we're already vitamin D deficient, and that plays a huge role, right, in our hormones and our mental health. And so trying to get outside and be exposed to that natural vitamin D as much as possible right
So
now.
the joke isn't true that somebody said they were getting a tan from the light of their refrigerator that they opened the doors.
Right.
That's not
If
not
that
vitamin
was
D.
the case, I would definitely be recommending everybody to open up their refrigerator doors, and I would be doing it myself.
The mayor just gave a challenge. I don't know if he called it the 100-mile challenge or the 100-day challenge, but encouraging people to get outside and at least walk a mile a day for 100 days.
Yes. Yes. And doing something incremental like that, where maybe the whole family can participate, or maybe it is just something for yourself. If that's part of your own self-care routine, give yourself permission to be able to do that all on your own. But if you want to include the family as well, absolutely do that. But just getting outside, the fresh air, it's just going to help distract us from our thoughts,
Okay.
right?
Great.
Anything that is sensory related is a really good tip to use for any kind of self-care toolkit that you implement. So think about your senses, anything that you see, feel, hear, smell, taste, but also think about movement and also think about pressure. So anything related to your senses. So essential oils. If I just need to sit and I just need to smell my essential oils for 5-10 minutes, that's part of my self-care routine. If I need to take a really cold shower, that's going to be part of my self-care routine. But all of these sensory factors are going to take us out of our head and bring us into the present moment to help us feel less anxious, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other ideas about coping? Those are all good suggestions.
Yeah.
And I suppose not necessarily binge watching Netflix is always the best sensory kind of thing, right?
So here's what I found myself saying. Exceptional times require us to make exceptions for ourselves. And so the word healthy, we sort of need to redefine it just during this time period, because a lot of the resources and the tools that we have access to normally, we don't have access to them. And so if the healthier option for us is to distract by watching a few movies a day, rather than sitting and stewing in our own thoughts and our fears and our frustrations, absolutely do it. If that's an effective way for you to distract right now, do it. That is okay. That is absolutely healthy.
Even the Tiger King?
Even the Tiger King.
Well, I hear you saying that's grace again, right? There's some grace in terms of what we do or what we don't do, or trying to figure out the routine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Think about a really helpful visual analogy that I like to use for myself is a spaghetti noodle. Are you going to be the cooked spaghetti noodle that's nice and flimsy and can bend and be flexible and adapt? Or are we going to be the uncooked spaghetti noodle where it's rigid and any little pressure to it, makes it snap? And so, can we just be gentle and flexible and bendable with ourselves and with our kids and remind ourselves, like another really essential coping tool right now is just to say, this is temporary. I
Okay.
wish we could define what temporary is.
Hmm.
We can't. But at the same time, history shows us this is temporary, right? We've never had a pandemic every single day that impacts our lives in this way,
Right.
essentially. This is temporary. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
But the other factor that I would also suggest is really limiting conversations regarding the virus, limiting social media, limiting your news intake. Be very selective right now about where you are getting your information. When you're connecting with others, I'm oftentimes hearing people say, well, what else are we going to talk about? I mean, there's no events to talk about,
Hmm.
there's no upcoming events to talk about. I suggest things like, would you rather questions. Would you rather do this or would you rather do this? Or let's plan our next vacation, our next ideal vacation. Just try to tap into your creative brain right now in terms of the conversations that you're having with people.
Okay. Those are good suggestions. My wife says to me sometimes, all right, turn that off. You're
Yes,
dwelling on this too much, or watching too much of that, or listening to
yes.
too much of that. So kind of get away from that. That's good
It's
advice.
easy to get sucked in. And so
Yeah.
if we need to ask a family member to kind of be an accountability tool for us to say, okay, if you notice that I'm just getting sucked in, help me out, just as a little external reminder,
Yeah.
because it is so easy to get sucked into all the information right now.
Right. Drives you crazy, or it could drive you crazy, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
But I
yeah.
think part of that too, I guess I'll speak for myself, is that we're looking for hope,
Yeah.
right? The vaccine, where are we at on the vaccine trials, where are we at on all the testing, and so we're constantly looking for information to try and instill just a little bit of hope and foresight into what does our future look like.
Right. Exactly. Trying to plan for the future.
Yes.
Well, anything else you'd recommend for us to cope with it, or anything else that comes to mind that
Yeah, just
we
one
should
day at a
follow?
time, really trying to, earlier when you were talking about that word adapt rather than accept, I used to know somebody who used the phrase, we're going to improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, how do I improvise today? It might not look like my life before this. It might not look like what my life is going to look like after this, but for right now, I'm going to improvise, adapt to the circumstances, the limitations that we have right now to keep us healthy, right? And then we will overcome.
Yeah. Make the adjustments and do it. Huh?
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Anything else?
Well, I would just encourage people that if they are looking for support during this time to reach out. Myself and most mental health counselors here in the Sioux Falls area and around the state are now engaging in telehealth services. And so
Great.
we're able to offer this kind of support from the comfort of your own couch or the comfort of your vehicle or the floor of your closet. I've seen it all. I accept it all. But this is really a good opportunity for people to reach out and get that extra support. The other factor that is making this kind of support more accessible and easier for people right now is that most health insurance companies have made an exception during this time to not only include telehealth as part of their coverage of their services, but most are actually covering telehealth at 100% at no cost share to
Wonderful.
individuals. And so this is a great opportunity for people to connect with support at a time when we don't need to do this alone.
Awesome. That's
Yeah.
great. I remember when I lived in Spearfish, I was pastor out there for 12 years. I mentioned at the Spearfish United Methodist Church. There was a young man in our church who was a member there, and he was also part of the Northern Hills Training Center community, if you were familiar with that or
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
And he used to tell me different times. He kind of had a sense of humor, but maybe he was serious. He used to say to me, Kip, I've got 2 words for you. Get help now.
Yeah,
And I would be like, that's 3 words.
yeah.
What's the difference? What I hear you saying is if people need to get help now, that there is there is help available, and
Yes.
I think contacting friends and all that, but sometimes people need more than what friends or family can offer.
Sure.
And I don't know if there's a kind of deciding point that helps people decide at what point do I say, you know what, talking to my friends or my family, I want a little more help than that. Do you have any suggestions in terms of when should we call you or someone else for
Yeah.
help?
Well, first of all, I think that reaching out to friends and family is helpful. I absolutely
Yes.
encourage
Oh, yeah.
that first and foremost. Oftentimes, what I hear people say, they appreciate the perspective of using a counselor when they really when they want somebody who doesn't know them, doesn't have an affiliation with their family, doesn't know their friends, essentially doesn't have an emotional tie to their family and friends because they feel like they're going to get an objective um, perspective on the situation. And have you ever received feedback from somebody that you knew and then received the same feedback from somebody that you didn't know, but it just feels different? It feels like we can be just a little bit more accepting sometimes of that feedback from, just this third objective party because it doesn't feel like they have any sort of stake or emotional tie themselves to whatever the outcome is that they're trying to support the person with. And
Awesome.
so if you're just finding that, of course, you're going to get good support from friends and family. But if you're wanting just a different kind of support, I would say just a different kind of support, reaching out to a mental health counselor, I think can be a really nice option.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time today. What we'll do at the end of this video is I'll post the connections of your name and your phone
Sure.
number and contact information. If people feel like they'd like to reach out to you, they'll have that available to them. But I
Absolutely.
thank you for giving us some of your time today and some of your expertise, and
Yeah.
we will get through this, right?
We will get through this. And I appreciate you taking the time. And it's been my pleasure to be able to reach your congregation. And absolutely, if anybody has questions or would like to make a connection, feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Kip.